Hello, my name's Rob from the YouTube channel Swift Slots and welcome to a Pendle Slot Racing information tutorial. In this video I'd like to talk to you about the PCS chassis most often offered with the Pendle Slot Racing range of resin kits. The PCS chassis is offered in 4 specification levels with the further choice of 2 optional extra parts. I will now take you through all of those options. Option 1 is the basic chassis consisting of the rear half and the adjustable front half and a small sprue of axle spacers. Option 2 also comes with the standard chassis, that being the rear half and the adjustable front half and the sprue of axle spacers, but it also contains a set of body mounts and a spare axle holder, stroke guide holder and an extra pair of axle spacers. Option 3 also comes with the standard chassis, that being the rear half, the front half and the sprue of front axle spacers, but it also includes the standard S-Can 18,000 RPM motor, pre-fitted with a 9-tooth nylon pinion. It also comes with a length of silicone wire, a length of copper braid, a slotting plus guide with appropriate screw, 2 guide spacers, 2 brass ferrules for your guide, and also 3 body mounting screws. Option 4 also comes with the standard chassis, that being the front and rear half, plus the 6 front axle spacers. It also comes with the 18K S-Can motor fitted with a 9-tooth nylon gear, piece of braid, silicone wire, slotting plus guide, some shims, slotting plus guide screw, 3 body fixings and the brass ferrules for the guide. It also comes with a pair of rear bearings and also a slotted 28-tooth crown gear in brass with 0 offset. It also comes with an option of 5 different length axles, that being 40mm, 45mm, 48mm, 51mm and 54mm long. The first of the optional parts for your PCS chassis is this retrofit glue-in front axle holder. It comes with 4 long M2 grub screws, which gives your front axle a far greater range of adjustment and a much better bearing surface for your front axle to run on. The second optional extra for your PCS chassis is the newly designed adjustable front end that actually comes with the 4 grub screws already pre-built into it by design. So this gives you a greater adjustment on your front axle and also gives you a much better bearing surface for your front axle to run on. It also comes with 2 channels for your silicone wire to run through, so it keeps the silicone wire away from your front axle and gives a very good springing action to your front guide. Okay, so here is a range of general modelling tools that you're going to need to assemble your PCS chassis. A pair of wire strippers so that you can prepare your silicone wire, a pair of long nose pliers so that you can put the ferrules into the guide, a pair of side cutting plastic cutters so that you can cut the parts from a sprue, a file so that you can clean those parts up, a general purpose scalpel for doing general purpose work, a 15 to 25 watt soldering iron and the relevant solder so that you can solder your wires to your motor, a small crosshead screwdriver and a 0.9 Allen key. This 0.9 Allen key is made by Pendle Slot Racing. It is absolutely ideal for putting on your alloy wheels and your crown gears. All of these parts can be bought from Pendle Slot Racing, not necessarily these exact tools, but certainly derivatives of them that will be absolutely ideal to assemble your chassis. So here we have the whole PCS chassis all laid out, ready for assembly, and you'll notice that I have a setup plate. Now you don't strictly need a setup plate to assemble your PCS chassis, but it does make life more convenient if you've opted for the optional extra adjustable front end parts. It's also more convenient when you come to fit your guide. Now Pendle Slot Racing do offer a range of setup plates on their website, so it might be something you might want to consider when you purchase your PCS chassis. The first step in assembling your chassis is to fit the motor, and I recommend you put the pinion end in first and then push the back end of the motor into place afterwards, like that. The next step is to fit the bearings, and they simply clip into the rear of the chassis like this. Then you want to take your gear, put your gear in place and then put the axle through the bearings and through the gear. And then with your 0.9 Allen key, you want to just nip up the Allen key just to hold the axle in place. You don't need much force at all. And that is the back end of the chassis completely assembled and ready to go. The next step of the assembly is to cut the wire in half so that we end up with 2 pieces of silicone wire. And then we simply want to bare the end of the wire, 8mm on one end, 3mm on the other. And then we simply twist the wire so that it keeps all the strands nice and tight. The next step is to take your ferrules and put the ferrule on the end of the wire that you stripped back to 8mm all the way to the end of the silicone wire, and then bend the wire over the end of the ferrule so it holds the ferrule in place like that. Do that to both wires. Next, you're going to want to fit your braid. So that is just a simple case of pushing the braid into the guide through the top and then bend it around so that the braid just finishes in line with the lower guide, and at the top you can just bend it over like that and then cut it off just past the actual guide holder itself like that, and do exactly the same to the other side. Once you have your braids fitted to your guide, I like to trim just the ends of the braids so they're nice and neat and they end at exactly the right place on both sides of the guide, just like that. Another trick that I like to employ when I fit my ferrules into my guide is take a toothpick and just ease the top of those holes in the braid just so that it makes the path for the ferrule a little bit more convenient. So once you've done that, what you then need to do is hold your ferrule in a small pair of pliers, and then you can push your ferrules into your guide. And then when you're finished, you should have something just like that. The next step will be to fit your guide spacers. Now these are a pair of spacers from Pendle Slot Racing, and they are slightly different in width. One is thicker and one is slightly thinner. Now there's no rule as to where these guides actually go, these spacers actually go, so you just have to use them in conjunction with the wheels that you've chosen and the body shape that you have with your chassis, and they simply slide onto the shaft of the guide just like that. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to put both of those spacers onto the bottom of the guide, which will give me maximum drop on the guide. But you could equally put one spacer on the bottom and one spacer on the top to control the drop of the guide and also the height. It's totally up to you how you do it. So then now once we have our spacers on our guide, all we need to do is put the guide holder on to the top of the guide and then put the assembly screw into the top of the guide and do it up with a small crosshead screwdriver. You don't have to do this up terribly tight, you just have to do it so it snugs down. And you could also use the distance of that guide to the distance of the screw there to just adjust the height of the drop as well. That is also an option to you. You don't have to do that screw up all the way. So, fitting the front guide holder to the rear of the chassis is a simple case of sliding the tongue and groove joint into the chassis, just like that. Now, in some cases, you might want to adjust the chassis to its fullest length, and in other cases, you might want to compress the chassis down to a shorter length. There is a trick that I will show you how to adjust this chassis all the way down to a very, very short length later on in this video, but for now, we're just going to assemble the chassis just like that. Now, in a lot of kits, Pendle Slot Racing suggests that once you have the chassis to the correct length and you've screwed it into your body, you can then simply glue the sliding joint into place. Now that is absolutely something that you can do. However, there are provisions for screws in the bottom of your chassis, and there's also a rail in the top of this tongue so that you can actually bolt the chassis together. Now there is a legacy part on this kit which is no longer needed on this chassis, but it's still supplied with the kit, and that is 2 hexagonal plastic nuts on this sprue of axle spacers. Now all you have to do if you want to is take the plastic nut and push it into that channel, and then if you're not using these screws to hold a body on, then you can use one of those screws to screw into the bottom and screw your front end down nice and tight. If you are using those screws to assemble a body, then you can simply use an M2 bolt to go into that plastic nut, and that will fit very, very nicely through the bottom of the chassis and hold these two halves together very, very well. And as you can see, there's provisions for 2 bolts if you wanted to use 2 bolts. And as I said, these are legacy parts, so they're not necessarily needed anymore, but they are there if you want to use them. So the last stage of assembling the chassis is to simply fit your front axle, and that's a simple case of sliding it through the chassis just like that, and then you have a range of optional spacers for your front axle. So that is just a simple case of cutting them off the sprue with your plastic cutters and sliding them onto the axle just like that. Now the final part to finishing off your PCS chassis is to solder your wires to your motor. Now in the UK at the very least, we power our slot cars on the left hand side of the car when looking from the front. So it's a good idea to check the direction of your motor first by using a small battery. And for that I'm simply going to put the battery on top of the terminals with the positive side on the left hand side and my finger lightly on the gear. And I can feel that the positive side is indeed on this side of the motor, so I am perfectly able to solder my wire straight to the left hand side of the motor. But it's worth checking because not all motors turn in the same direction, some are different. So the way that I like to solder my wires, if I don't have my handy hand available, is just simply to use a clothes peg. So we can put the clothes peg just there and then simply tin the wire ready to go onto the motor. Just like that. And then we can do the same to the other wire. And once we've tinned the wire, we can then tin the motor. And then it's just a simple case of soldering the wire straight to the motor. And that concludes the building of your PCS chassis. It's now just ready for wheels and body kit of your choice. So now I'd like to explain to you about these 2 optional extra parts. This front axle adjuster is an optional extra part to retrofit to your already made chassis if you would like a little bit more fidelity in the adjustment of your front axle. And you will see that it has a little lip here and a little lip here. Those 2 lips go at the front of the chassis, and this little adjuster simply drops onto the chassis from above and it holds in place perfectly nicely. Now you can see the little adjusting screws for your front axle. Now the way that I would fit this is I would get a scalpel and I would just make this axle slot in your chassis just a little bit wider to give your axle a little bit more clearance, because you do not want these pieces here to interfere with the axle. Then all you need to do is put a bit of glue on the side of your axle holder there, and then drop this piece straight on top, just like that, as simple as that. So once your front axle adjuster is now glued to your chassis, you are then free to put your axle into the actual holder, just like that, and then you can adjust the top screws to lower the axle down, and then adjust the bottom screws to lift the axle up. You'll obviously need to do them in sympathy with each other so the axle moves up and down smoothly, but now you've got the full adjustment of your front axle ready to go. So if you're building a brand new chassis, you might like to take advantage of the fact that you can buy that exact same adjustment already built into a brand new tongue. So that is literally a simple case of pushing the whole thing straight into your chassis without any other work needing to be done, and you can simply put your axle straight into this adjuster and you have all the benefits of the retrofit one, apart from the fact that it's now all in one and ready to go on your brand new build. So now I'd like to show you the two extremes of the wheelbase that you can get from this chassis. The first maximum wheelbase is very easy to get. You simply slide the front into the back and you bring the hole to its furthest location, and then you can put a locking bolt in there or glue the chassis together, and in that combination you will get a wheelbase of approximately 93 millimeters. So the other option is to cut the tongue down to its shortest length possible. Just like that. Once you cut your tongue in half, you will then need to do a little bit of cutting on your chassis, because now the front guide will be much closer to the chassis, the main chassis, and the wheels won't have anywhere to turn, so you need to just trim away the chassis to allow the wheels to clear. So after a little bit of chopping around with your plastic cutters and scalpel, your front end should look similar to that. And this is the extent that you need to chop the back end down. A little bit of relieving on the top, a little bit of relieving on the sides, little V in there so that your guide can still function, and you need to take away these little sliders on the side there so that the front end can clip in. So once the front end is clipped in, you'll see that there's still a hole there to put your bolt through or glue. And then all you need to do then is assemble your front axle in and your wheels on. Now you will see that we have an incredibly short chassis indeed. And with the chassis set up in this configuration, you will get a wheelbase of approximately 55 millimeters. Now that's not as short as this chassis can go, because you will see that there's actually this fitting back here, or here, which is the body fitting. Now you can actually chop another 5 millimeters off of this front end, so all of this piece here, and you can actually get that hole there to line up into the bottom of the body fixing hole, and that would gain you another, or lose you another 5 millimeters. So you can actually get the wheelbase of this chassis all the way down to 50 millimeters. And that concludes this tutorial video on the PCS adjustable chassis kit, often offered with the Pendle Slot Racing range of resin slot car kits. And I hope that I've addressed any queries that you may have, but if I haven't, there's a contacts at the top of the Pendle Slot Racing website. If you send them an email, they will get back to you to answer any of your queries. So if you fancied any of the Pendle Slot Racing resin kits but were too scared to start one because you're worried about the paintwork, we also have another video just based on painting the body where we use simple techniques to get a really great finish. So hopefully you'll watch that video as well if you're interested. So from me and Pendle Slot Racing, thank you very much.